All right, this is 11 honors, and we are reviewing just a minute for the test, which will be on, will be next week, which I need to get on.
So do we have a Huck Finn test next week
No.
or a Whitman test?
We're going to do Whitman, and we're going to put probably Huck Finn the week after that. All right, you ready? All right, so if you have it in front of you, I just want to go through this. The lecture notes, make sure that you study those. Especially on the biography of each author, there are only 2 authors, and the characteristics of the author's poetry, that being the most important thing of those 2, is that, like, you ought to be able to say, I would recognize a Whitman poem because these qualities are in it. Same thing with Dickinson. And then 2, and this is the main thing, know the main idea, theme, and speaker and literary techniques used in each of the following. So we've done not all of these. Let me go ahead and point the ones we haven't yet done. We're going to do My Captain and Cavalry Crossing a Ford. We read the cavalry one yesterday, but we didn't answer it. So, oh, by the way, welcome back. Look at the Dickinson one. We are not going to do, if you were coming in the fall, you can just mark that one out. So we're going to do all the ones there. The Frigate one, the Stop for Death, the Fly, Lapping the Miles, and A Narrow Fellow, but not If You Were Coming, which is actually a good one. I'd like to do it, but we just don't have time. And we've already done I Hear America Singing, and When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. And so you need to know the main idea of each. For instance, and we've done this before, let's take I Hear America Singing. We just did that the other day. Do you remember anything about that? Well, I was just going to remind you the things you needed to know about it. The main idea of that, anybody remember the main idea? I Hear America Singing?
Is it like the working classes
Yes.
better?
Or
just
what?
Like that they're good?
Yeah. Yeah, he focuses on the blue collar working class, the people that worked with their hands. All the I think there were 10 or 12 occupations mentioned, and they're all that kind of job, not the so-called white collar job. And they were singing, figuratively. Maybe they were singing literally, but why are they singing? Right. We pointed out that most people don't sing when they're sad, although there's a type of music called the blues, which I guess is about people being sad. And also, you know, I can think of some, but we generally think of people sing. Even the Disney folks, you know, came up with "You Whistle While You Work." You remember that from Snow White? Did you know they're doing Snow White again? I think they're doing Snow White again. A live action Snow White. I think they're coming out with one, but it's already controversial.
Oh no, I saw that. Did you see that? Yeah.
Do you know the story of Cyrano de Bergerac? Well, in the story, they have this knight who has a long nose, and they're doing another one of those. I'm not sure if it's a TV movie or if it's a theater movie, but I think it's a musical, Cyrano. But Cyrano doesn't have a long nose. He's a little person. And the whole point was that Cyrano is not attractive, the guy with the long nose. And he falls in love with this ill-attractive woman and was too afraid to tell her. And so that's their compromise with this, their version of it. But anyway, both are...
Short?
What?
That he's short?
He's what they call him little person, something like that.
They should.
All right, well, let's go back and just look at I Hear America Singing just for a minute. The main idea, we just mentioned that, which is kind of the theme. So it focused on the working class and the fact that they like what they do. The speaker, in this case, is usually Whitman. We don't usually say that. We don't usually say the poet is the speaker, but for these purposes, and except for number 3, maybe The speaker is Whitman. The literary techniques. Do you remember the literary technique that was used in the poem? Well, he used listing or catalogs. It was a poem filled with lists, and which was and he used, of course, free verse, which is absence of rhythm or meter and the absence of rhyme. So free verse, prominent, and there are two things. Usually I'm asking just for one, but there are two things there, the listing and the free verse. Well, you know how to do this then. We are going to remake before we leave O Captain and Cavalry. We'll do Cavalry. There's no frigate like a book. Yeah, everything, but we'll do this. And I would like to do it maybe next Wednesday. I'll check it out. I haven't looked yet. So next Wednesday. Seven, 8, 9. All right. Would you get out the questions for Huck Finn? 30. We'll just do some of these today, 30 through 31. I think we got through the other ones yesterday. Yeah, we did. And so this is 30, 31. According to Hemingway, the book becomes less interesting, maybe? I don't know. He thinks that the book loses its power about this time. And so you still have 13 chapters to read at this point. But, and so we did one. We know how did the gull save the Duke and the King? Remember the last time?
It was like hidden in the coffin? So
Right, and so how did that work? How did that save them? And Huck, too, for that matter.
Did they like slide away? Wait, slide away. That's
No, I know what you meant. Well, what does that have to do with the goal?
I'm not sure.
Well, because they were so surprised that there was gold in the coffin, everybody's attention was diverted from the Duke and the King and from Huck. That's when they got away. So they did slide away. Nobody actually knew that they had gotten away at that moment. They were so astonished that the gold was there. And the sad part of this story was that Huck thought he was free because they got on the raft and they were starting to float down the river, and Huck thought they had gotten rid of the Duke and the King, but the Duke and the King had gotten there before he did. So they were still on board. And they become darker at this point in the story. The Duke and the King become they're almost comical up to this point. They hurt some people. They didn't really physically hurt anybody, but they're fairly comical. But that's changing at this part of the story. Okay, number 2, from the boy walking on the road near Pikesville, what does Huck learn has happened to Jim?
He's been captured and sold.
Yes, and so really, who sold him?
The king or the...
I think it was the king. So he sold him for very little, because they've lost all their money. They got out of there with nothing. They didn't give up their money from earlier, like the Royal Nonsuch. All the money they won from that, there's probably some left, but not much. All right, so number 3, number 4, and number 5, and number 6, and number 7. These are all kind of go together, so we need to look at that. Alone on the raft, Huck suffers agonies of guilt and misery. What does he feel guilty of? Now remember, Jim has just been sold. And why does that make Huck feel guilty?
Doesn't he feel guilty that he feels sad that the slave was captured, or then he feels guilty because he thinks about stealing him back?
Why would stealing him back make him feel guilty?
Because he is stealing someone's they say property.
You're right. I would like to tweak that just a little bit. What he feels guilty is that somebody else stole. Who does he belong to? Who is his owner? Miss Watson. So he feels guilty that now Ms. Watson has, again, lost her investment in Jim. So he feels guilty about that. What letter does he think he should write? You can't sell someone else's property. So if people who steal stuff do, but that's illegal. And so he realizes that the selling of Jim to somebody else would be illegal because he's already someone else's property. So that's what the letter's about. He wants to write Ms. Watson and tell her that what has happened. So she can get her slave back. What does he do with the letter? And write this down, guys. I'd usually like to give you credit if you write them down.
He writes it, and then he feels better, and then he realizes he cares too much about Jim, so he tears it up.
Yes. He can't turn Jim in for the second time, at least. But the second time that was made into a big deal. The first time was when the slave catchers were coming by, and he lied, and they went away. So what does Huck finally resolve to do about Jim? And you said it just a minute ago.
Steal him back.
He goes steal him back. All right, number 4. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. What is the lie that keeps Huck from praying?
Is it that he stole or kept the slave? Or I don't understand what it is. I know where it says it, but I don't understand. Oh, is it saying that he is saying he did the right thing, but in his heart he wouldn't?
Yes. I was just trying to find it. I think he was praying for forgiveness. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check that. But he's not sorry. And so he can't pray something that he doesn't believe. Yeah, he says, I prayed to see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy that I was and be better, so I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try to hide it from him, nor from me neither. I knowed very well they wouldn't come. It was because my heart wasn't right. It was because it wasn't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say that I would do the right thing and the clean thing and go and write to the slave's owner and tell where he was. But deep down in me, I know it was a lie. You can't pray a lie. So he wanted to be a better person and write the letter to Miss Watson and tell her where he was. And he said he didn't, deep down, he didn't want to do that. And you can't ask God to do something that you don't really want him to do. Does that make sense? All right. Number 5, after writing the letter, Huck is racked with indecision. I was a-trembling because I had to decide betwixt 2 things, and I knowed it. What were those 2 things?
Is it him knowing that slavery was we said earlier that he doesn't, like, it's not that he's against slavery or anything, but he sees it as like a rule. And so it's like that he has to go against that rule. Is that one of the things?
Yeah, basically. And the idea that he was willing, or could he turn him in? Could Huck turn Jim in, or would he not? And if he turned Jim in, he would be doing the right thing, but if he didn't turn Jim in, he would be sinning, and what happens to people that sin, they go to hell. And so literally he says, all right, then I'll go to hell, and tore it up. So think about where he's come from at the beginning. Remember, he played a trick on Jim? You remember that? He played 2 tricks on Jim. He played 3 tricks on Jim. Remember the hat trick? And remember the snakeskin trick? And you remember the fog trick? You know which ones I'm talking about? Okay. And each one he began to change. He didn't care. He didn't worry about it the first time. He was sorry the second time, and the third time he actually confessed and asked for forgiveness. But isn't this a level beyond that? Not only was he got to the point he could ask a slave to forgive him, but now he's willing to go to hell for a slave. To me, that's very important, and it just shows you how he's committed to Jim as a friend. Would you be willing to go to hell for somebody? I don't think most people would if they're Christians. And that's answer number 6, of course. Why did he tear it up?
He decided to steal Jim.
Yeah, he's not going to give him up. He's not going to write that letter. All right. Number 7. As a result of this moral crisis, does Huck realize the institution of slavery is wrong? And you already said that. Would you repeat it, Sierra?
What?
Number 7. Does he realize the institution of slavery is wrong? That Huck, does he ever realize that slavery is wrong?
I guess.
I thought you
not
said it
really.
just a minute ago.
He doesn't really like see it as like right or wrong, kind of. Or does he see it as wrong? Or like, I don't know. He sees it as wrong, but he doesn't really do anything about it because it's just like the way it is.
I see your point. I really think you could safely say he doesn't see it's wrong.
He doesn't.
That's why in violating that, by helping a slave escape, he feels so badly, because he feels like he's doing the wrong thing to help a slave. Has Miss Roberts ever mentioned, I don't know what she would call it, but there's a name for people of one generation looking back at another generation and saying, in history, and saying, well, if I was there, I would have done this, and they shouldn't have done that. Has she ever talked about that? You get it? You know, for us in the 21st century to look back 150 years and say, you know, what they were doing is wrong. Some people say that we don't have a right to say that. I think some things are clearly right or wrong regardless of what century you're in, like slavery. But I think it is wrong to think that we would have done something different. Most people wouldn't. If we had grown up like that, many of us probably would have felt just like us. So number 8, the answer is no. And you have to decide, does it make him seem more or less admirable? Remember, Huck is just 14 years old, and Huck is a product of his culture. So I don't think we can judge him too severely. The adults should know better. Huck is not an adult. And number 9, many readers of the novel regard Huck's struggle with his conscience as the climax of the novel. What earlier episode in which Huck experienced moral conflict foreshadows the final struggle? In what way is Huck's final decision even more courageous than the earlier one? So remember, there are 2 times in the book where he thinks about giving Jim away, giving him up, sending him back. And so we mentioned those 2. The slave catchers one, and now this one. And it says, in which way is this decision more courageous? Well, I mean, he says he's willing to go to hell, so even though he doesn't really understand hell, you might argue that that's more courageous than the first time, where he said he just couldn't give him up because Jim was such a nice guy, and he liked him. This now he's willing to go to hell for him. Let's do a few of these. The Phelpses are that's the location of where Jim was sold. And Huck is greeted by Ms. Phelps or Aunt Sally. What are your first impressions of her? Do you remember anything about her?
She's happy.
Yeah, she seemed like a nice person. And pretty harmless, right? I think that's fair to say.
She's kind of, like, she's kind of, well, she's like racist.
Yes, she is. How do you know that?
Because she's like, was there any trouble? Like, why were you late? And Huck said there's like a crash or.
Yeah, the steamboat blew up.
And like, no white people died, but there was a black person that died. And she was like, so there's like no injuries.
Did you pick that up on your own?
A little bit.
Because that's really important. That may be the most important statement in the book. I'm just curious, because some people overlook that, but the fact that you noticed it was important, I think, is really. Yeah, I mean, looking right at it, I'm looking right at it. It says, we blowed out a cylinder head, and Aunt Sally says, good gracious, anybody hurt? And Huck says, no, ma'am, killed a slave. And she said, well, it's lucky because sometimes people do get hurt. So she doesn't even consider the dead slave a person. And they're not to these people. It's chattel slavery. They own property. And so that may be the most significant statement, most powerful statement in the whole book. And you'll see it again when we have a test on this. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but we'll. Aunt Sally assumes that Huck is a visitor. So who does Huck pretend to be because she thinks he is him?
Her nephew.
Tom Sawyer. That's who Aunt Sally thinks Huck is. So that's kind of A and B. He kind of goes along with it, and he's happy about it. He's happy that he likes Tom. And number 3, Huck intercepts the real visitor coming from town. How does Tom react in first seeing Huck? Why? Do you remember?
He thinks he's a ghost.
And so he's scared to death. He thinks Huck is dead. Hadn't seen each other since chapter 10. How does Tom help Huck out in his predicament with the Phelpses? Now, he's the real Tom Sawyer. So Huck, they think Huck is Tom. So what does Tom pretend to be?
Huck's friend, or Tom's friend.
Yeah, Tom's brother, actually. Sid, as in Sidney Carpenter, our friend. All right. In the evening, Huck and Tom sneak out of the house. Have we read this far? Yeah, I think so. Why does Huck want to go to town? What do the two boys see as they enter town? So this is chapter 33. Yeah, this is chapter 33. What do they see when they go to town? They just want to see what's going on. They want to get news. But B, what do the boys see when they enter town? They see a tar and feathering going on and two men being ridden out on a rail.
The Duke and the King.
Yes.
And Huck is like, I feel bad, even though like they did a lot to Huck. Like he feels bad about it because
Yeah.
it should never be done to a person.
Right. I mean, that's an awful torture. I'm reading near the end of the chapter. Well, it made me sick to see it. I was sorry for them poor, pitiful rascals. It seemed like I couldn't ever feel any hardness against them anymore in the world. It was a dreadful thing to see. Human beings can be awful cruel to one another. And this is another example of a mob. It's another example of violence. And it's another example of of Huck's compassion for people, even people that don't deserve it. But you're right, they don't deserve that either. They're not nice people, but they didn't deserve being treated that way. And I don't remember where it is. I was looking for it. But number 5, when Huck tells he intends to set Jim free, how does Tom respond?
Offers to help him.
Right. And then number 6, why does this distress Huck?
Because like Huck's always looked up to Tom, and he's always thought Tom was like always wanting to fit in socially and like everything. So freeing the slave would be really bad reputation. Would be a really bad reputation.
You really get this. That's really important. Near the beginning, he says, I'm about to say Tom Sawyer fell considerable in my estimation. He said, only I couldn't believe it. Tom was a slave stealer. He uses the N-word. So it's just ironic that he thinks less of Tom, that Tom is willing to help Jim be free. Because he knows he's a bad person for doing it. He just thought, like you said, that Tom wasn't so bad. And will bring us to the end of this. 4:34. Okay, it's chapter 34. What is basically Huck's plan for? This is important. It's a little thing, but it's important. What is Huck's plan to free Jim?
Was he the one who wanted to like Saul?
Saul, did you say? I think so, because I think he's still in chains, but how are they going to get him out of like he's locked in a,
Dig him out?
well, they were going to steal the key and use the key to get him out, which is a very practical, simple idea. On the other hand, what's Tom's plan?
Break down it and like saw off his leg.
Right, which is basically the rest of the book, from 35 to 43, which you're going to need to read for next week. He basically, it's enormously complicated and ridiculous. And so I think that's part of the reason why some people think this part of the book is inferior to the rest of the book, because it's so much like this. It's so complicated, unnecessary. Are we about to leave? What time do we need to leave? 55. All right, so we have a few minutes. All right, so I'm going to ask you to finish the book by next week. Right now, I'll just say, what is it, next Wednesday? You've got plenty of time to do it. Next Wednesday would be
I bet I could take that piece
9. Okay, so finish the book by 2/9. Also, we're going to have this test in about a week. So you have a little over 5 minutes. Would you use this time to see what you have? If you have the answers to these questions, just check. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, we've done this before, I'll give you some class time to share with others, like what you know about it. Like, do you know these things, the main idea, the theme, the speaker, the technique? So you can work, Delaney, you can work with them. I mean, you just have a few minutes, but it's...
Do I use